Okay. Hello, Joanne.
Hi, Natalie.
How are you?
Great. How are you?
I am so happy to have you as our guest for our interview Thursday. Today is a special day. Today is Yom HaShoah. Today is the Holocaust Day. And I was wondering because our interviews are every Thursday. And when I saw the calendar, I was like, should I cancel because it's Yom HaShoah? And then I said, no, this is the opportunity to share and to even talk more about Yom HaShoah. And then I thought about you, and I'm so happy that you're here to talk about this.
Thank you. I love the opportunity, and I'm so grateful to tell the rest of Jewish history that we weren't just victims, that we are also heroes. And in the days
Exactly.
of remembrance, we need to remember the victims, the survivors, and the heroes.
Exactly. And that's exactly why I'm very happy that you're here. But before we started with this interview, I would like to read your bio because not everyone knows who you are. And we have posted the biography, but I do want to share with everyone who you are and what you've done. So, Joanne D. Gilbert is an award winning author who grew up in the 1950s, 60s in predominantly Jewish Oak Park, Michigan, where she was profoundly affected by the experiences of neighboring Holocaust survivors. Her life and work have been inspired by the stories told by her grandmother, Millie Ron, who, unlike most of her relatives, had been able to leave Vilna, Lithuania, before the Nazis destroyed the Jewish community there. In their honor, Joanne is dedicated to finding and celebrating Jewish heroism during the Holocaust. Her presentations, as well as her books, Women of Valor, Polish Jewish Resistors to the Third Reich, and A Victory for Miriam, the little Jewish girl who defied the Nazis, have received outstanding reviews. Her next book, Women of Valor, German, French, and Dutch Resistors to the Third Reich, will be published in 2022. Wow. So this is your life's work, basically, Joanne, right? And
Absolutely.
as you know, this is the Born to Do business global community. So we're always talking about the Born to Do. And what I love to ask people when I interview them, one of the first questions that I love to ask is, when did this whole start? This whole story of you, because you talk about your grandmother, you talk about how your whole life was dedicated to this. So can you take us back in time and share with us when did this passion for talking about the Holocaust or talking about the resistance, like when did it all start? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It started before I was conscious enough to know it was starting. It was built into me in the first place. My earliest memories of my grandmother were the two of us sitting together, cuddling in a big chair. And instead of reading children's stories to me, she was showing me her photo albums that she had been able to take with her. Most descendants of Holocaust victims don't have photos, but my grandmother got out in time, and so she has photos, including photos that the family sent until 1940. And I would see these photos of old Vilna and the cobblestones and the people and the clothes. And instead of wanting to be Cinderella, I wanted to walk into those photos and walk down those streets and be with those people. And I was struck by how they looked like us, where we had no relatives. We didn't have cousins. No one looked like us. And I would ask my grandmother, what happened to them? Where are our aunts and uncles and cousins? And she would get teary eyes and her hands would reach out and she spoke Yiddish. She would say, I don't know, but Hitler got them. And I didn't know what Hitler meant. It could have been anything. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older and learned about Hitler that I understood that my family, our people, were wiped out. And then as an American kid, I got kind of irritated. What do you mean they got wiped out? Why didn't anybody help them? That's just unacceptable. If it happened to us on our little suburban street, I'm sure we'd all help each other. And then, of course, I learned later that no, we wouldn't all help each other. Some of us would help each other, but other people wouldn't. And so I had those questions. Who helped us? Did we fight? Did my Auntie Rivka go silently like sheep to the slaughter? I don't think so. And so those principles were governing my life before I knew that they were. I knew that if I didn't help, then I was on the same continuum as a Nazi. And so even in elementary school, if somebody was being bullied, I would always, even though I was small, I would always stand up for them. And I became kind of known as a tough guy. Don't mess with her. And so it was a lifelong thing. And in high school, I became very active in civil rights. And nobody was involved in civil rights at that stage. And I also was involved in women's rights. We were the forefront of the contemporary women's movement, and also in the anti-Vietnam War movement. So I was compelled from my very first interactions with my grandmother to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And it's a tremendous honor. It's a tremendous responsibility. And because there are so many problems, there's an infinite amount of time to feel like I'm not doing enough.
That I'm sure. But when I hear you speak and when I see, the way you speak about the Holocaust, there's one thing that I really appreciate is that you speak about how the Jewish people were not victims, right? Because usually the Holocaust Day or Yom HaShoah or the Day of Remembrance, we feel sad, we feel bad, and we it is a horrible story, is an understatement, and so there is some kind of maybe feeling that we let ourselves, like you said, being slaughtered, or that no one really reacted. And what I like about what you're saying, which is very refreshing, and I don't think a lot of people talk about it, is that no, the Holocaust is not just a story of victims. So can you talk more about things that we don't hear so much, like how did the Jewish people rebel or react? What is your point of view of that?
There was resistance everywhere. There was resistance in the worst camps. There was resistance in the worst ghettos. Every time there was a Jewish person that was being oppressed, there was some kind of resistance, whether it was spiritual by hanging on to their faith, by practicing a candle lighting when all they had was a match and no candle, whether saying a prayer, whether encouraging someone else to go out and fight with the partisans, whether it was sharing a piece of soap so someone could stay clean. There were uncountable instances of resistance, and every Jew resisted to the point of extreme desperation. Just getting up and facing another day was huge resistance. And while, yes, we need to always remember and commemorate the horrific circumstances of the Shoah, it's only part of the story. And for those of us who grew up in the shadows of the Holocaust, as first generation free people, growing up with all of the stories, we are still, at this age, we are still living in the cloud of horror. We grew up with nightmares. We didn't know that there were heroes. And we were deprived of knowing the great courage of the Jewish people before, during, and after. Because after, the survivors had to show courage by continuing to live. My grandmother in her 90s, when she would talk about her mama, she would still cry. When she talked about her father, who died of natural causes before the Nazis got there, she would say, again in Yiddish, "Thank God Papa died before they came." When you're a little kid and you hear your grandmother say, "Thank God my father died before the Nazis came," you have to live your life making up for that. So it's important we know about the heroes, everyday heroes. And I hope that my books and my presentations provide much more in-depth information on those topics.
I'm sure they do. And specifically, what I also like about the way you do your presentations and what's in your books is that you speak specifically about women, women of valor, women that were the one that were resisting, that were fighting back. And that's even something that we hear less. I mean, if we don't hear about the resistance and the heroes, we hear less about the women. So can you share with us, I know you've interviewed and you're telling the stories of so many women, but can you share with us, like, what was specific about the way those women were resisting? And maybe if you can share with us one or two stories, that can give us a little bit more, details.
First, I want to make sure that everyone understands I'm not diminishing the resistance of the men, but the men have gotten some recognition. When Nechama Tech wrote her brilliant book, Defiance, upon which the movie was based several years ago, the men started getting some recognition, but not the women. And it's very important to me to show that Jewish women were heroines in their own history, in their own narrative. And I didn't have a PhD. I didn't have a research assistant. I wasn't part of a university. And my first instinct was, I'm nobody, I have no right to do this. I will not do it effectively, and in so doing, I will dishonor the survivors and the heroines and the heroes. I didn't feel like I had the right to do that, but I didn't have a choice. It was like my family was saying, we don't care if you don't have the right. No one else is doing it, so just get up and do it. And it occurred to me that, in a way, finding these women, in spite of me being nobody, was almost like, for them, joining the resistance. They were just regular people on Tuesday, maybe playing cards with their girlfriends, doing their hair, giggling about a boy they just met. And then the next day, maybe they were out of town when the Germans took everyone in their village away. They were just regular people. And when we look back, we think, oh, they were heroes and I'm just a regular person. But no, they were just regular people, ordinary teenagers, ordinary girls, playing with makeup, getting mad at their parents because they couldn't stay out late. They were regular people who had to function in extraordinary ways. So I went out and contacted every Jewish organization, every synagogue, every sisterhood, knowing no one would respond to me. I told them what I was looking for: true stories of women who defied the Nazis and their collaborators when they were teenagers. And I started getting emails back. Yes, I know a woman. I know, here's another one. And it was like, oh no, now I'm going to fail because there's too many of them. I can't meet them all. So I had to make a decision, which was, I have to narrow it down to people who speak English. I don't have any money to pay translators, and I didn't have money to travel. So I had to narrow it down to women who spoke English. Well, a couple of the suggestions were women in the Detroit area, where I would travel every year. So, okay, now I'm further narrowed down to Manya Feldman and to Miriam Brisk. And then I have family in Toronto. One of the women lives in Toronto. So there was no real pedagogical reason for my initial choices. It was, they're old, I'm getting old, who can I get to fast? I had been a personal historian where I would work with survivors to create a memoir, whether it was for publication or for their family. And one of my clients had a phenomenal story, Ben Lesser. And while he was telling me his story, he started talking about his sister. His sister Lola. And after a while, I wanted to know more about Lola because she was the woman I had been looking for forever. And Lola lived in Borough Park in Brooklyn. And when I was done with Ben's book, I said, Ben, would you introduce me to your sister, Lola? Do you think she'd talk to me even though I'm nobody? And he said, absolutely. I've been telling her, I've been sending her chapters. She already loves you. She would love to meet you. And I said, would it be butting in? Would it be imposing if I asked her to tell me her story? Because it's a Holocaust survivor. Everybody's always taking advantage. Tell me this, tell me that. Come talk here, come talk there. I didn't want to be one of those people. And he said, absolutely. And we didn't have Zoom then. And I called Lola and we set up a meeting, and I begged, borrowed, and stole money to fly to New York. And I went to Borough Park, which was like entering another century. And she opened the door, and it was like one of the Gabor sisters. I don't know if you know who Zsuzsa and Eva Gabor are. They have several gorgeous sisters. They were Hungarians. They were beautiful movie stars. And they spoke with a heavy accent. And when Lola opened the door, she said, oh, it's so wonderful to see you come in. And she gave me a hug and it squeezed the breath out of me. And she had such a meal put out. And she was an artist. And all of these gorgeous paintings, I'd seen some of them at Ben's house. They were all, it was like a gallery. And she, in fact, did have a gallery in Borough Park. And she, in fact, had been friends with one of Picasso's daughters. And she had amazing, amazing stories. And hers were different than anybody else's because she was blonde, she was blue-eyed, and she passed for Gentile. And she became kind of a courier of information in and out of the ghetto. She also was able to confront Nazi officials in their offices. She would have to beg, borrow, and steal fancy clothes that were cast off because she had to walk like a Gentile. She had to be arrogant. She couldn't have a Jewish gaze in her eyes. Her eyes could not reflect horror. When she took on new identities, sometimes more than one a week, she would go to a place. The first thing she would do would be to go to the Catholic Church. She had learned everything she needed to know about being Catholic, and she fit right in. So changing a name from a Jewish name to a non-Jewish name, changing identity is more than just the language. It's your entire being. She had to be the consummate actress. And she had to know things like recipes. When she was in a ghetto before she escaped, she was in line for deportation with her family. And she was stopped by the clerk. They were taking names before they put them on the trains. And where are you from? And she mentioned that she was from a place in Hungary. And he said, well, you're Hungarian. You don't need to be in the ghetto. You don't need to be here at all. You're free. And he said, meet us tomorrow at headquarters and we'll get you your papers. So the next day she was let out of the ghetto. She thought they were going to abuse her, molest her. She had no idea. She was 17 and gorgeous. And everyone was crying because this was going to be the end. And she walked out of the ghetto and they led her to a gorgeous former Jewish doctor's home that had been taken over by the Germans. And she knew she was going to probably be raped and then killed. And so this is a teenage girl brought up in a religious home with loving parents, loving siblings, suddenly in this situation. She walked into the office and the commandant got up and walked around and she thought, oh, he's going to do it already. And he said, you know, you don't need to wear this Jewish star. And he tore it off. And she thought, now he's going to tear my clothes off. And he said, get comfortable. We're going to talk a little bit about what you're going to do next. And she said, this is really, really obscene. He's acting like it's a normal visit when we both know what he's going to do to me. But in fact, it was a normal visit. He was one of the Nazi commandants that actually helped Jews get out. He was eventually denounced and executed for his work. If you had told me that 15 years ago, that there had been a good Nazi, I not only wouldn't have believed it, I would have been offended by the idea. But there were. And again, I'm so grateful to have lived long enough to learn it. Well, Lola didn't bat an eye. Chutzpah personified. He told her he was going to have his secretary make out her papers. And she said, well, what about my family? They were born in Hungary too. And he said, okay. And she was able to get her whole family out of the ghetto. And they were able to function because she was an artist and her other brother was an artist. And they set up an underground identification paper forgery factory. Their mom was in charge of using tea to make to put on the paper to make it look aged and crinkly. And they created hundreds of Hungarian fake IDs, including for the Babover rabbi, who, if he hadn't gotten out, his centuries-old dynasty would have died with his family. But instead, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of members of the Babover dynasty now in Borough Park. And whenever they have any kind of event, when Lola was still alive, they would thank her for making their lives possible. So Lola's story is amazing. It's one of the chapters in my book, Women of Valor. And it was hard to say Polish because she was in fact born on her grandparents' estate, which on the day she was born happened to be in Hungary. Sometimes it was in Czechoslovakia, sometimes it was Poland, and her family's house, her parents' house was in Krakow. But her mother she was pregnant, she didn't feel good, she wanted her mom to take care of her. So pregnant mom goes to Munkacs, and that at that point was in Hungary. And so that's where Lola was born.
Wow. Well, it's amazing to listen to you. I could hear you all day. This is like, I think that your ability to tell a story and to make it alive. I mean, I have a feeling that I saw Lola opening the door and giving you a hug when you said, the way she hugged you, it was so vivid that I think this is the best description that you can make for people who want to know more, to read your books. But I see even more like to invite you to speak and to present, because even more than the books, I think that the way that you bring this to life is so much more alive and inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing Lola's story. And I am so grateful that you're really bringing to light first the heroes, because like we said, not a lot of people speak about them, and then the women. And I can't help but notice that, to compare that the Jewish people and the women seem to have the same destiny, because the Jewish people also, we don't speak about them as heroes, and the women also, we know that, when we speak about women's rights, we know that there are stories of women that have fought and have also been, more active than, when we speak about the collective. And so there is a nice parallel between the Jewish people and the women.
Well, I was going to mention to you, when you introduced your group and you mentioned that we were purpose-driven, yes, that we created networks, that we help each other, that we build bridges. I took notes, that's why I keep looking down. Yes. Yes. Everything you said was a quality possessed by these teenage girls in the resistance. Everything that you are trying to do, and bless your heart for doing it, it was necessary to the success of these women. And very often people will say, well, how did you survive? And some people will say, well, God was watching out for me. And then other people will say, does that mean God wasn't watching out for my mother? It's a very controversial thing to say. Other people will say, I was just lucky. And in many regards, They were lucky. It was good timing. But underneath that good luck were some very female qualities. And those were the qualities that you mentioned at the beginning of your meetup group. And I just thought that was spectacular.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that those qualities are the qualities that are keeping our people together. And even if we don't hear about it all the time, we're lucky to have people like you that write books and that present and that speak and that communicate about it. And so I'm very, very grateful that you accepted to take this interview. And I want to say, to everyone who is listening to this interview, that if now that you've seen how Joanne is talking and how she's presenting, if you know of any organization and in today's world, because we forgot to say that you're sitting in the US, right? You're in Las Vegas, right? And so but today, in today's, we can do all this on Zoom. So we can do presentations on Zoom, and we would also love to see you in Israel. So if someone wants to invite you and speak in Israel, that would be just the best. That would be wonderful. So this is a shout out to anyone who knows any community or sisterhood or organization or synagogue or any place where Joanne can speak, can present her books, her stories. And again, I think that buying your book is great, but having you speak is even better, because we just get it live. So thank you so much.
Thank you. One of the things that would be very helpful is occasionally people will chip in to sponsor purchasing a class set of my books and donating them to a school, because many states now in the United States are mandating Holocaust education, but they don't have appropriate books and the schools can't afford them. And so teachers have reviewed my books, have used them in their classes from 6th grade through university, and have been very, very grateful for having access to those materials. I include teaching materials with both books. So if your school suddenly says you're teaching Holocaust education tomorrow, my books will provide what is needed, but the schools can't afford it. So I'd appreciate anybody sponsoring books for schools.
Of course. And we have your email and your website in the post on top of this live. So anyone who wants to be in touch with you knows exactly where to reach you. And I really hope that more and more people read your books, invite you to speak. And I think that your message is amazing. And thank you so much. Thank you for bringing us hope. And, it's a touch of optimism and, being positive in this day that, of course, we need to remember. So thank you so much, Joanne. Thank you.
Natalie, you are wonderful. Thank you so much. Be safe.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.